All right, strap in, everyone. We're going deep on Deuteronomy today.
Oh, yeah, Deuteronomy.
Stacks and stacks of material in this one. It is, of course, the fifth and final book of the Torah,
Right.
known for its laws, sermons delivered by Moses to the Israelites on the cusp of entering the Promised Land.
You could say it's Moses's
Right.
grand finale.
It is. It's the grand finale before they go into the Promised Land. So with all this material, what are we going to zero in on today? Think of it as a highlight reel. We're going to look at the major themes, the events, and we're going to see why this book still matters.
What's really interesting about Deuteronomy is that it's not just a dry law textbook.
Right.
It's structured as this series of passionate speeches by Moses,
Oh,
almost like he's reliving the Israelites' journey with them.
interesting.
He's reminding them where they've come from, their covenant with God, and just how impactful their choices are going to be.
So it's like Moses is giving these, epic pep talks.
Yeah.
But I mean, is he just reminding them of the good old days? Is that what's happening here?
Not quite. He doesn't shy away from the tough stuff either.
Oh, okay.
He reminds them of the highs and lows from escaping slavery in Egypt to their wilderness wanderings.
Right.
And let's not forget the golden calf incident.
Oh, yeah.
That's one story that he uses to show how easily they could stray from God's path.
So it's a remember where you came from kind of message.
Exactly. Moses just drives this idea of remembering home.
Yeah.
He wants them to remember their history, not just for nostalgia, but because it's tied to God's faithfulness and the consequences of forgetting him.
Yeah, it's like he's saying, don't repeat the same mistakes, but there's also this call to action in Deuteronomy, right?
Yes.
Like, here's how you should live. And that all starts with the Shema.
The Shema in Deuteronomy 6.4-5, it's like the bedrock of faith for the Israelites. It's that powerful declaration. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might.
Well, you're right.
It's not just about acknowledging God, it's about complete devotion.
Okay.
About loving him with every fiber of your being.
And that love is not some kind of passive feeling,
No.
right? It's supposed to translate into action.
Precisely. Loving God with everything you've got means living in a way that reflects that love.
Yeah.
Following his commands with that same wholeheartedness. And that's where the extensive law code in Deuteronomy comes in. It's like the Shema lays the foundation.
Yeah.
And the laws provide the blueprint for how to live out that love in practical day-to-day ways.
So let's dive into some of those laws. We've got sources that highlight, a pretty wide range, some of which might surprise you. For instance, Deuteronomy emphasizes social justice, going into detail about protecting those who are often overlooked.
What's striking is the focus on caring for the vulnerable, the poor, widows, orphans, and even foreigners.
Wow.
Take the law of debt release every 7 years. It's this radical idea designed to prevent families from being trapped in perpetual poverty. It speaks to a system that values the inherent dignity of each person and aims for a more just society.
It's amazing how forward-thinking some of these laws are.
And it doesn't stop there. Even in warfare, Deuteronomy outlines rules of engagement.
Oh, wow.
Including offering peace to a city before attacking it. It's a recognition that there are limits, even in war.
Right.
A moral code that seeks to minimize unnecessary bloodshed.
Wait, offering peace before conquering?
Yes.
That's not what I expected from an ancient law code.
It might seem surprising, but it speaks to a desire for justice and restraint, even in the midst of conflict.
So we've got social justice, laws of war. What other areas does this law code cover?
Deuteronomy gets into all sorts of nitty-gritty details of life. It covers family matters, marriage, divorce, inheritance, even dealing with rebellious children. There's this one law that tends to raise eyebrows today, the one about a man having to marry a woman he's raped.
Yeah, that one definitely jumps out. It feels so out of step with our modern understanding of consent and justice.
It's crucial to understand this law in its historical context.
Yeah.
Scholars have offered different interpretations, taking into account the social dynamics and cultural norms of the time. It's a reminder that interpreting ancient texts requires careful consideration of the vast differences between their world and ours.
Absolutely. It's not about condoning those practices, but understanding the complexities of the historical context.
Right. It's about approaching these challenging passages with humility and nuance.
Okay, so Deuteronomy delves into family dynamics, but it also gets into the seemingly mundane, like ritual purity, right?
Yes. Even in the midst of military campaigns, there are detailed instructions about hygiene and ritual cleanliness. It's like a reminder that holiness wasn't compartmentalized for the Israelites.
Right.
It was woven into every aspect of life,
Interesting.
even something as practical as waste disposal. Remember the requirement for a designated latrine area outside the camp?
It makes you wonder what we're missing in our modern lives by separating the sacred from the secular.
Yes.
Deuteronomy seems to challenge that division head on. But it's not all sunshine and roses, right? There are some pretty stark warnings in there, too.
You're right. Deuteronomy doesn't shy away from the consequences of choices. It lays out in vivid detail the blessings for obedience
Okay.
and the curses for disobedience. This isn't just some abstract theological concept. It's presented as a stark reality for the Israelites.
Okay, so the choose wisely kind of message.
Exactly. Imagine a land overflowing with abundance, a thriving community, peace within your borders. That's the promised blessing for following God's commands. But then Deuteronomy flips the script. It describes the curses that await those who turn away from God. Famine, disease, defeat in battle, exile from the land. It's a powerful contrast, meant to drive home the gravity of their choices.
It's like standing at a fork in the road, one path leading to flourishing, the other to devastation. And Moses is pleading with them to choose the path that leads to life. But it's not just about following rules to avoid punishment, is it? There's something deeper going on here.
Absolutely. Deuteronomy emphasizes that true obedience flows from a transformed heart.
Yeah.
A heart that genuinely loves and desires God. Remember that powerful image in Deuteronomy 10.16. Circumcise, therefore, the foreskin of your heart and be no longer stubborn.
Circumcise the foreskin of your heart. Okay, that's some vivid imagery. Break that down for me.
It's a metaphor, of course.
Right.
It's a call to inward change, to remove the barriers that prevent us from fully surrendering to God. It's about aligning our desires with His will, allowing His love to transform us from the inside out.
So it's not just about outward actions. It's about cultivating a heart that truly loves God and delights in His ways.
Precisely. Deuteronomy is pointing us towards a life of wholehearted devotion to God,
Yes.
where our love for Him shapes our thoughts, actions, and ultimately our entire way of life.
That's a powerful message. And we've only just scratched the surface of Deuteronomy. There's so much more to unpack, from specific laws to the role of the Levites, and even those challenging passages that might make us uncomfortable. We'll dive into all of that and more when we come back.
Welcome back. Before we went on to other topics, we were talking about this really fascinating idea of blessings and curses in Deuteronomy. And you mentioned it's not just about outward obedience.
Right. It's about a transformed heart, a heart that genuinely loves and desires God. But, honestly, when I hear these vivid descriptions of blessings and curses, it makes me think about how we often view God today. Sometimes it feels like we've softened the edges a bit.
Right.
Focusing more on His love and grace, while maybe downplaying His justice and holiness.
I see what you mean. It's true that our modern sensibilities, they can make it challenging to grasp some of the more, shall we say, intense aspects of the Old Testament.
Yeah, like the idea of God sending curses or punishing disobedience. It can feel, well, I don't know, harsh, even vindictive to us.
It's important to remember that for the Israelites, this concept of divine justice, it was woven into their understanding of the world.
Right.
They didn't see it as cruel or arbitrary, but as a natural consequence of violating a divine order.
So less about God being angry and more about the natural consequences of straying from His ways.
Exactly. And those consequences, they weren't just individual either. They believed that their collective obedience or disobedience could affect the entire nation.
Oh, wow.
It was like this shared responsibility where everyone's choices had ripple effects.
It's a pretty big deal then. Upholding those laws, caring for the vulnerable, living in harmony with God's commands.
It was about creating a society that reflected God's order.
Yeah.
A society where blessings could flow freely. But remember, Deuteronomy doesn't just address outward actions. It dives into the heart of the matter, emphasizing the need for a heart that truly loves God.
Like we were talking about before, it's that circumcise your heart imagery.
Yeah.
A call to align our deepest desires with God's will.
Yes.
Okay, well, what about specific instructions? I'm curious about the role of the Levites in all of this.
Sure.
Our notes mention they play a unique role.
That's right. The Levites, descendants of Levi, they were set apart for very specific tasks. They were the priests,
Okay.
responsible for leading worship, offering sacrifices at the tabernacle.
Right.
But they were more than just ritual performers.
Okay, so more than just going through the motions.
Much more. They were teachers, interpreters of the law,
Okay.
and guardians of the covenant.
So they held a pretty important position. But how are they supported? I mean, we know the other tribes received land inheritances.
Yeah, the Levites didn't receive land.
Interesting.
Deuteronomy really stresses the importance of respecting and supporting them, recognizing that their service was essential to the well-being of everyone. It was a way of acknowledging that their spiritual work had value and deserved to be provided for.
Like recognizing the value of spiritual leadership.
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't produce, tangible goods or wealth.
It certainly makes you reflect on how we support those who serve in spiritual roles today.
Yeah.
Think about pastors, teachers, missionaries. Do we truly honor and uphold those dedicated to guiding others toward God?
That's a great point. It's easy to overlook the importance of spiritual leadership in our, fast-paced world. But speaking of challenging perspectives, we've got to address the elephant in the room. Those parts of Deuteronomy that might make modern readers uncomfortable.
You're talking about those passages that seem to clash with our modern sensibilities.
Exactly. We touched on the law regarding a man marrying his victim. But there are others that deal with purity rituals and even violence that might raise some eyebrows.
You're right. Some of these laws can seem strange or even disturbing to us today.
Yeah.
Take the detailed instructions about handling bodily discharges, the disposal of waste, or the purification rituals after childbirth or touching a dead body.
Yeah, the designated latrine area, even during war.
Right. While those might seem like excessive rules to us, remember they reflect a deeply held belief in the holiness of God and the importance of maintaining ritual purity within the community.
So it's less about hygiene in the modern sense and more about aligning oneself with God's standards of purity, both internally and externally.
Exactly. While we might not observe these specific rituals today, they do prompt us to consider what practices or habits might hinder our relationship with God. What might we need to circumcise from our hearts, so to speak?
It's an interesting way to connect these ancient laws to our own lives. It's about identifying those things that get in the way of our relationship with God.
Right. Those things that we might need to let go of to move closer to Him.
Okay, so we've got purity laws. But what about those passages about war and violence?
Sure.
Deuteronomy talks about the Israelites conquering cities, and the instructions can sound pretty harsh.
It's true. There are sections where God commands the Israelites to completely destroy their enemies, leaving no survivors.
Right.
These commands, particularly in Deuteronomy 20, have sparked a lot of debate and interpretation.
It's hard to reconcile those commands with the image of a loving and merciful God.
I understand that. Remember, we're looking at a very different historical and cultural landscape. The ancient world was a brutal place.
Yeah.
And warfare often meant extreme violence.
So are we saying that God condoned this kind of brutality?
It's not that simple. There are several layers to consider here.
Okay.
First, we need to understand the concept of divine judgment as the Israelites understood it. They believed that God was active in human history, using nations and empires to achieve his purposes.
So they saw these conquests as God's judgment on the wickedness of the Canaanite nations.
That's one way to look at it. Deuteronomy describes the Canaanites engaging in idolatry, child sacrifice, and other practices considered, abhorrent to God. And the Israelites believed they were acting as God's instruments in purging the land of this evil.
But still, the level of violence described in some of these passages is difficult to process.
It is. And even within the biblical text, there's a tension between the command to destroy and the possibility of mercy. Think about Rahab.
Oh, yeah.
The prostitute in Jericho who helped the Israelite spies.
Oh, right. She and her family were spared, even though Jericho was destroyed.
Exactly. Her story suggests that even in the midst of judgment, God's mercy could be extended to those who turn towards him.
It's a reminder that God's ways aren't always our ways.
Yeah.
And that there are complexities and nuances within these stories that we might not fully grasp.
Absolutely. As we grapple with these difficult passages, approaching them with humility is key.
Right.
We're looking back through thousands of years of history and cultural shifts.
So how do we make sense of these texts today? What can we learn from them, even if we don't condone the violence they describe?
I think there are a few key takeaways here. First, these passages remind us of the seriousness of sin and the reality of God's judgment.
Okay.
While we may not see God intervening in human affairs in the same way today, The principle remains.
Okay.
Our choices have consequences, both for ourselves and for others.
That's a sobering thought. It makes you consider how our own actions might contribute to injustice or harm in the world.
Precisely. Second, these passages highlight the importance of obedience to God, even when his commands are difficult to understand or seem to contradict our sense of morality.
That's a tough one. I mean, how do we know when we're truly following God's will? Especially when faced with conflicting moral claims.
It's a question people have wrestled with for centuries.
Yeah.
Deuteronomy itself offers some guidance,
Okay.
emphasizing seeking wise counsel, studying the law, and ultimately listening to God's voice within our own hearts.
So it's not about blindly following orders.
Right.
It's about engaging in a process of discernment, seeking to understand God's will in complex situations.
Exactly. That process often requires us to wrestle with tough questions,
Right.
to acknowledge the tensions and the ambiguities within the text itself.
It's a good reminder that faith isn't always about having all the answers.
Yeah.
It's about trusting God, even when we don't fully understand his ways.
Beautifully said. And that's the kind of trust Deuteronomy ultimately calls us towards. A trust that empowers us to live lives of courage, integrity, and compassion, even in a world that can be broken and unjust.
We've covered so much in Deuteronomy already. Holy war, divine judgment, the seriousness of sin, even those seemingly mundane purity laws. Before we wrap up this section, are there any other potentially challenging passages that we should touch on?
There are a few laws relating to sexual ethics and social boundaries that might raise eyebrows today. For example, Deuteronomy 22 has a law that prohibits a man from wearing women's clothing and vice versa.
That one definitely seems rooted in a specific cultural context.
It does. And while we might not interpret it the same way today, it does reflect a concern for maintaining clear distinctions between the sexes and upholding a particular social order.
It highlights the importance of understanding the cultural background of these ancient texts.
Yes.
And avoiding imposing our own modern values and assumptions on them.
Exactly. It's a call for humility and careful interpretation, recognizing that our understanding of gender roles and sexual ethics has evolved over time.
So for our listeners, what's the key takeaway when approaching these challenging passages?
Sure.
How do we navigate them in a way that's both honest and faithful?
I think it boils down to approaching the text with both reverence and critical thinking.
Okay.
We need to recognize the authority of Scripture, while acknowledging the complexities of its historical and cultural context.
It's a delicate balance. We don't want to avoid the difficult parts, but we also want to avoid interpretations that oversimplify or ignore the nuances and tensions within the text.
Exactly. And it's crucial to remember that the Bible is, at its heart, a story of God's love and redemption.
Right.
Even amidst those challenging pronouncements, there's always this thread of grace woven through the narrative.
It's a reminder that God is always drawing us towards himself, seeking to transform us, to make us whole.
And that's the core message I hope listeners take away from our deep dive into Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
It's a book that challenges, convicts, and ultimately points us toward a God who loves deeply and walks with us on this journey of faith.
Okay, so we've covered some heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But Deuteronomy isn't just about rule and judgments. It's also about Moses handing over leadership to Joshua, a new generation stepping into their destiny. Let's shift gears and explore that transition as we head into the final part of our deep dive. All right, we're back for the final part of our journey through Deuteronomy. We've explored everything from laws and social justice to, those challenging passages about war and divine judgment. But before we wrap up, we've got to talk about the changing of the guard here. Moses is stepping down, and Joshua is about to lead the Israelites into the Promised Land.
This is a pivotal moment in their story, full of symbolism and significance. Deuteronomy actually ends with Moses commissioning Joshua as his successor.
Okay.
This act, it speaks volumes about the continuity of leadership, even in times of transition.
Right.
It shows that God's plans and promises, they endure, even as one generation gives way to the next.
It's like passing the torch.
Yeah.
A symbol of hope and a new beginning for the Israelites. But it's more than just a change in leadership, isn't it?
It's a reminder that God remains faithful to his promises, even as circumstances change.
Yeah.
For the Israelites, this transition marked the culmination of their journey. They're finally on the verge of entering the Promised Land, the land that God swore to their ancestors.
And they're about to embark on this new chapter under Joshua's guidance. I mean, it's exciting, but also a bit daunting, I imagine.
Absolutely. There's a mix of anticipation and uncertainty there. But Moses, he doesn't leave them empty-handed.
Right.
He imparts his final blessings and words of wisdom, reminding them of the lessons that they've learned, urging them to remain faithful to God.
So it's like a passing of the baton, but also this reminder of their shared history and the importance of carrying those lessons forward.
Precisely. Moses' final words are like a charge to the next generation,
Yeah.
a call to remember their past, embrace their future, and above all, to hold fast to their covenant with God.
It's a poignant end to a really powerful book. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into Deuteronomy. We've explored its laws, its history, its challenges, and ultimately its message of hope and faithfulness.
We've seen how this ancient book, it wrestles with some complex issues like justice, mercy, obedience, and the human condition. And while some of its passages might make us uncomfortable,
Right.
they also invite us to engage in deeper reflection, to grapple with these timeless questions about faith and ethics.
Yeah, it's a reminder that engaging with Scripture, it's not always easy or straightforward,
Right.
but it's a journey worth taking.
And through it all, we see a God who's deeply invested in his people, who guides them, challenges them, and ultimately offers them a path to life and blessing.
So what's the final takeaway for our listeners?
Okay.
What do we hope they walk away with after this deep dive?
I hope they see Deuteronomy not just as an ancient law code, but as a living document that speaks to human heart across millennia.
Right.
It's a story of a people's journey with God, their struggles, their triumphs, and their unwavering faith.
It's a story that challenges us to examine our own hearts, our own relationship with God, and our own commitment to living lives that reflect His justice, mercy, and love.
And as you continue to explore Deuteronomy on your own, I encourage you to approach it with both curiosity and humility, asking God to reveal its truths and to transform your heart.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Deuteronomy.